Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Ann Russo in Women's and Gender Studies at DePaul University, and we're here today as part of the WGS 391 class, which is one of the capstone classes on methods and scholarship in women's and gender studies. And today we've invited Dr. Rocio Ferrera to come and talk to us about her research. Dr. Ferrera is an associate professor of Latin American literature, culture, and cinema, and the chair of the Department of Women's and Gender Studies here at DePaul University. She earned a doctorate in Latin American literature and in women's gender and sexuality studies from the University of California, Berkeley. She specializes in 19th century and contemporary literary and visual culture written by women. Her areas of research are foundational narratives and journalism of the 19th century, war literature, 19th through 21st century, and contemporary issues related to the configurations of memory in literature, culture, and cinema. She's published critical articles in academic books and journals. Today, we are discussing her essay, quote, "Breaking the Silence, Telling Histories of the Peruvian Post-Internal Armed Conflict," unquote, that was published in Dialogo in 2020. So if everyone could please welcome Dr. Rocio Ferrera. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Ferrera.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, for the invitation to be in the class, because also this is a way for me to get to know our students. Since I teach in a different department, I don't always get to see you until you do a presentation or we run into each other. So this is a very nice opportunity to see some of you. Just to talk a little bit about my research, I come from the humanities and from literature and film studies. So my research is totally embedded in reading in literature and film, the ways that certain political, social, economical, racial, class issues are told from the point of view of different women writers or other subjects, and how they approach those issues from within literature or film. I have done a lot of work on 19th century narratives by women during the construction of the nation. And I was looking at the journals because at the time that I was doing that work, the whole construction of the nations in Latin America during the 19th century were read and studied from the point of view of the patriarchals, all the males that were constructing the nation that were close to the state. And so we only knew from their point of view how they were thinking about the new nations and what it was legit, to talk about, and who were citizens and who were not citizens in those new nations. And then there was a big war, or different wars, through the process of the independence movements in Latin America. So I tried to see what were the narratives that women were constructing at that point. So I work with a lot of journals at different archivals through Latin America and Europe, and here too in the United States, that they have conserved those journals from the 19th century. And I was trying to see what women were saying and how they were talking about all these issues, how all these different wars and new laws that were being created were affecting at the different subjects, and how their voices, were not heard at the time. But also, there was a very interesting process, because in different parts of Latin America, women were talking about the situation of indigenous people or African Latin American people. And they were talking about what were the issues at stake for them not to be considered fully citizens. But that was also a way for women to enter into the different discourses about the nations, because also they were not fully included as citizens, as the state men. And then after that, I continue working with different narratives through the 20th and 21st century. But the project that I'm doing right now, it's what you read, that's part of the big project. I'm writing a book. And I'm looking now at Peruvian narrative done also by women or different subjects that are talking about what happened during the armed conflict that took place from 1980 to 2000, and how also, we're in the 21st century, but again, everything that we read, we hear, or the narratives that are highlighted are the ones provided by male narrators, male poets, male directors of films, and so forth. So, in a way, my work also always wants to shed light on those discourses that are not necessarily upfront. And a lot of these discourses are not read, or people don't know about them. So my work is informed by different theories, by different ways of thinking. I read fiction literature, like novels or poems or performances or films from sociological, political point of view. Not so much. I put all my interest in the aesthetics, but in the content. So because a lot of the works provided and produced by these different authors, they want to tell us something about what's taking place in history, in politics, in everything. And the way to talk about it is through fiction, through poetry, through film, especially, for women that are not in the mainstream of this production. So for me, it's very interesting and very important to talk about the process of what happens with the colonial coloniality of Latin America, because the colonial moment, it was 300 years. So most nations have been nations, countries for 200 years. So that patriarchal state structure is very um, powerful. So how do we talk about different issues when that structure is still in place? So how these different narratives are in a way using different ways to decolonize that ideology, that way of thinking, that way of seeing all the different subjects in these nations. So I come from different theories of colonial thoughts and decolonial thoughts, and also from different, of course, feminist theories that we all study and see how those discourses are telling us ways of doing things in a different way. And also, my work, it's centered in the theories that are also produced within Latin America. Like we have feminists that talk specifically about, for example, I work a lot with Andean writers and Amazonic writers. So they have a very different way to see how to approach all these issues from their own communities. So, for example, I can share with you right now, I've been working with Maria Galindo, and it's called Feminismo Bastardo, which is a bastard feminism, because she doesn't come from the academy, but she knows all the colonial and decolonial discourse because she is an activist and she does all these things. She is from Bolivia, which is an Andean country, and she does all this work with Andean um, queer subjects, women that do not want to be labeled, as Andean indigenous people, or all the work that they do. It's to decolonize the minds of everybody, and also, to fight against the powers of coloniality. Because even if the structure is a little different now, it's not very different with certain subjects. So here, other subjects, women, indigenous, African descendants are always, at the bottom of this pyramid, which is very vertical still. And it has these three power places, like, you have like what it was in the monarchy was the king, then you have the pope because it's Catholic, the religion, and then the armed forces. We don't have a king or vice royal state, but we have a president, we have armed forces, and then of course we have the archbishop who is in place. Most of the countries are already lays. It means that the Catholic Church is not part of the state, but they act as part of the state. That hasn't been really broken. So all that, it's very important to see when you read all these different works and to understand all the problems that are embedded within all these different discourses, because unfortunately they still resonate to that moment of the colonial ideology and how all these different um, writers, filmmakers are trying to bring all these different complex problems, situations, experiences to light for us to see something that it wants to be erased, silenced. They don't want to make those available for us to talk about it. So that's pretty much, the work that I approach, because I work mainly, with cultural artifacts, either in literature, film studies, performances. I study how they are bringing all these issues at stake through their works. And they are always, bringing very important reflections of what is taking place and that is not otherwise discussed within the nation that we're talking about. And also, another book that has been very helpful for me to understand more things is the work of Rita Segato. I don't know if you know her, but she's been translated. Maria Galindo hasn't been translated yet because her work is more recent, but Rita Segato talks about, the coloniality of power. And she, that's a very important work, theoretical speaking, to see how the relationship, with the different groups that were all mixed together during colonial times and what is that in the present day, and how the different discourses through the years have tried to like change or erase. Because if at one point we were talking about the coloniality of power, they wanted to get away now, especially in the last few years, because it's the 200 years of the bicentenary of the independence movements, and they want to move us away from that discourse of the power of coloniality. But it really, you cannot see that in a different light, because it's very, very, very present today in the 21st century. So Rita goes through the different decades and centuries to see how they want to change that discourse, um, but it doesn't go anywhere pretty much. It's modern. We have a neo-colonial state. It could be a neo-imperial state, but still, it's totally embedded in that structure of power, that it's this patriarchal society in this triangle pyramid that at the level of the state, it hasn't changed much, although there are a lot of groups, um, non grassroots NGOs that are doing beautiful work, to decolonialize this way of thinking, of moving, of seeing all the citizens that are together in these nations, that the same problems are still present there. But the works of art, are talking about that. So that's what I'm interested in seeing through the work that I do, looking at culture. So I think that might give you a better idea of what I do. And I don't know if you want to make any questions or comments.
Okay, we'll open it up to the group. Do people have thoughts or comments or questions that you want to pose for Dr. Ferreira?
I had a question about like how you got into fiction literature, and if like, have you ever, like, do you also write fiction and poetry, or like how are you drawn to that?
Um, well, I always work with literature. So um, my first, well, through high school and everywhere, I always been, in the world of literature. It was a world that gave me a lot of peace and um, a personal, like, um, safe space. So I study comparative literature. I come from comparative literature, and then I did a lot of work with different literatures from different parts of the world, and I like to see that, how literature is talking about the present situation. I do some writing. I don't publish creative work, but I do some writing. Yes, thank you for the question.
Thank you.
I have a kind of follow-up to that, which is like when thinking about, there's a relationship like in the article that we read for today, kind of the relationship between, these Truth and Reconciliation Commission and people telling their stories, and then the way that, writers are also creating fiction. And I just wondered about is there a certain kind of freedom that literature offers, writers and thinkers and critics, who are challenging these structures of power? Is there, I don't know, just thinking about the difference between kind of people who are activist writers, or people who are journalists, who are also, advocating or arguing for change, and the relationship with that with the fictional literature. How do they intersect? Or
Yeah, the process was very interesting because in 2000, we have a dictatorship by a president, Fujimori. And then when he left the country and went to Japan to seek for asylum, he sent a fax, renouncing to his presidency. And so we have a transitional government. And then Peru is one of the few countries that had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Think about South Africa, right? The apartheid. And few countries in the world have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So what happened is that when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission started doing their work, they were focusing in a lot of different things that were silenced for many years, also because of the different ethnic groups that are in Peru. Most of the people in the coastal area were not really looking at the suffering and the way that the war affected people in other regions of Peru, like the Andes and the Amazonian. So they were trying to see what happened if it was, all the damage, the way that human rights were violated was done by the subversive group Shining Path. But then when they start doing all the research, going to the different towns in the country, they realize that the armed forces have caused even more damage, and they were worse, in terms of human rights than the subversive group. They were like vis-a-vis doing the same things, although the armed forces were supposed to be protecting the citizens, right? But because they were indigenous people talking different languages, we have many different languages in Peru, they were treating them just, as expendable, um, not citizens, expendable people, I don't know what to say. So they were just, disappeared in mass graves by groups, but whole towns. So I'm telling you all this because when they started doing all the reports, they were gathering a lot of testimonies from the local people to start finding out that there were so many like mass graves that nobody knew about them. So they start discovering all these different, the toll of numbers, it came to be from those testimonies, close to 70,000 deaths and disappear, which is a very big number. And that's what we know. There are probably a lot of unknown stories and sites that still we don't know about them, right? So what happens is that the testimonies were very important. The journalists were doing a lot of really great work, but at the very beginning in the transition, a lot of people were scared to talk, or even journalists, because before a lot of people was incarcerated because they were so as doing apology for terrorism. So if you talk about the things that were taking place in other places, you could be called a terrorist because you were doing apology, and you could be incarcerated. So the process was a long process. And then even when the report of the Truth and Commission, the short one, because then they continue working, was published in 2003, they haven't done a lot of work with gender issues, okay? Starting from the cases of women and all different subjects and different genders. So that wasn't even taken in consideration. So here is when literature, especially written by women and also other genders, starts being produced, because they want, in a way, fill that big gap, that big hole. So that's what literature and films that were produced at that time, to show um, what other populations, even, oral traditions from indigenous people wasn't taken in consideration, because of course there is no literature produced, not fiction, but any type of literature, right? They go by oral histories. So little by little, different actors, from different organizations, journalism, writers have been trying to fill those gaps. And most of the literature, in the case of my work that I look at, fiction, narrative, poetry, performance, in films, most of those works come from cases from the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when people did not want to talk about it. They didn't want to be published. They were scared because, it was a very sad situation for a lot of other genders and women, the way their bodies were treated, right? So those stories, were told by others. And there's always a conflict because they're not told directly from them. I also have looked at a lot of the testimonies, but a lot of the testimonies are in the indigenous language, and I'm not a person that speaks those languages. So they're being translated now for us to understand, those of us who do not speak those languages, that we can understand those testimonies. There's a lot of material that other people study. So there are a lot of work that is being done from the different disciplines, from anthropology, from social sciences, from linguistics, from, people in philosophy. So there are different approaches and different ways of looking at this moment, this disruptive moment of the national history of Peru. So I don't know if I answer your question, Anne, but.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Or thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I was really interested in this reading that you, the two of the stories that were included,
Mm-hmm.
that you discussed were about not victims, but about perpetrators of the violence in Peru. And you wrote the important about El Grito. The importance of this story is not to minimize the harm engaged in by actors of war, but to highlight how the unattended psychosocial aspects of trauma due to the CAI impacted all those involved and society at large. Action is needed, screams herstory. And so I was curious if you had any ideas about what that action looked like, or I know these are fictional stories, but for situations like this, like what do you see, what do you envision for addressing situations like this where there are perpetrators? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No. Thank you for the question. That's very good. Well, in the case of that short story by Claudia Salazar, no, The Scream, El Grito, it's been translated. You can read it. You can find it in if you Google it. Well, those were many cases. Again, it is fiction, but it's based on the reality of the different testimonies. So, unfortunately, we are in a moment that the repairs are are being done very slowly. And in the case of soldiers, what's the case? Like we can compare to what happens here when soldiers are deployed to go in any type of war. There is I don't know if this is the expression in English too, the cannon meat, like who is in the front, who is in first, mostly kids that are either immigrants. In the case of Peru is the same because it's young people that come from the different Andean provinces of Amazonian before the coastal people will be in the front to go and fight, right? So, and also a lot of people that enlist in the armed forces, if they enlist, it's because of need, of economical situation, not so much because of ideology or politics. Not all of them, of course, but a lot of them, most of them. And I think we can see that parallel here too. We have a lot of kids who have been trying to get an education here that belong to different groups that they need an education, and they see that they can get a future enlisting through the armed forces, right? But then when we deploy a war, they are the first ones to go. And mostly they're going to suffer, right? Because they're going to be the ones that are exposed in the war. It's not going to be the ones that come next or other ones that have a higher rank. So like in the Grito, I think that Claudia Salazar wanted to show the situation of many young women soldiers that had to do this, and they also are traumatized because to be in a war, but because they were in the armed forces and they were the ones that were killing other human beings that were not necessarily the subversive ones, they cannot tell their stories. They won't come to give their testimony because it's a very difficult and complex situation. So most of them were exiled in, like here in the United States or other countries in Latin America or Europe, but they don't come to tell their stories, right? Because they were killing people. So it's a very difficult situation for them, and also for the people who were part of the Shining Path, for example, in this case. So what are we doing with all these people? There are a lot of organizations that are working with them to help them to do some shrinks, to talk to people about their own experiences and guide them on where to go. But a lot of people is not ready. It takes a lot of time for them to come and tell their stories and go into a process of healing. So I think that the story is important because of that, because we always think that, oh, they were so bad, they were killing so many indigenous people and they were not part of Shining Path. But then also they were victims of this state, the state, And I don't know if you remember the other short story, because you were talking also to the other one. It's written by Jennifer Thorndike, and it's the los dedos, I don't know, on the fingers, because she used, she's using the metonymy about the hands and the fingers to tell the story about how forced sterilizations were done through 300,000 indigenous women, mostly women because it was like 280,000 women and 20,000 men who were sterilized without their consent, and how they had a quota, right? And that's totally story that comes from a testimony of a doctor who felt really bad, about what she was doing, but it was part of her job. And they did this for years. And the government totally denied that it was something that they have imposed in the health ministry. And that was a way, of eugenics to eradicate the possibility of all these women giving birth to new terrorists, right? A cleaning. And that was, it's been done through the years in different parts of the world. In Europe, in the Second World War was done. Here in the United States, it's done to different populations from different ethnic groups that they were not so welcome at certain points. So they did the same thing in the 21st century and 20th century in Peru, but that was totally silenced. Like nobody wanted to talk about it. And the government totally denied until they couldn't deny it anymore, because even the doctors who were in positions of power came out telling that, yeah, it was a program by by the government. And yes, they were performed in that uncivilized way. You don't even do that to any of your pets or animals. And so I think those stories are important because it brings to light situations that maybe some people would not hear from other resources. So I think it's like an eye opener. If you're just reading short story, then you will say, "Whoa, wow, this happened. Where does this come from?" So I think it has that importance, right, to reach maybe other population that do not know about what was taking place. Of course, journalists and people were digging to put that in the front of the news line. And finally, the government had to say that, yes, it was a plan that, from the government. Yeah,
Thank you.
sure. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I just want to ask a follow-up to that, like in terms of the book's reception, because I was thinking, the book really holds these complex stories, and I think about different audiences taking up those stories and kind of the conflict, the potential conflicting feelings about the different stories, right? I think that's unusual to have those stories in one collection. And so I wondered, like when the book came out, like who was the audience and how did people navigate that? Or was that also something that came out in the, I know more about the South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but were these also narratives that people were able to offer apologies, or, did they, I don't know, do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Well, they did, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did that at that time. They gave apologies, and they have different sites through different cities in the whole country, remembering the death and everybody who suffered. So there are a lot of also sites to remember all this with the apologies and all that. But the thing is that a lot of the literature that comes out is by small presses, editorial press. So it's very difficult because, again, for women to publish still, and even, for filmmakers to do film when you are from a different gender, or if you are a woman, it's very difficult. So there are a lot of great publishers that they themselves are creating, and they do all this beautiful work that is very important. but of course, it doesn't have the same circulation. So like this project, Al Final de la Batalla, at the end of the war, that was compiled by Ana Maria Vidal. She is a human rights lawyer, and she was helping all the Andean women to give their testimonies. And also, she was one of the defenders of all the sterilized women. So she had this idea, to have this collection from well-known writers, women writers, and to read all these different testimonies and write about it. So it was a beautiful project, and it was presented in many places, and the books were given for free in many different areas and presented in different book fairs. But of course, it reaches a different audiences. But also, when you publish a book like that, you don't do 5,000 copies, right? You do a very small number of copies. So it has its limitation. But children and young people use a lot the libraries, the public libraries, so it is available. And I think that's probably the target audience for young people to know what happened. And that's what, for me, is very important to read all these works to see what they are doing, and also to bring them to light and to know about the history, the politics of of different countries in Latin America, in this case, Peru. And then also for you to know that there are these short stories that are not just fiction, and I'm not reading them for their aesthetic um, ways of giving us stories, but because of the content in itself, and bringing to other parts of the world. Um, this article, normally I write mostly in Spanish and Portuguese. So this is the first article that I publish in English after many years. And the reason is because I want people to know here what took place, that might not know of what happened at that point, and also to get to know about the different writers, because here you always hear about a number of male writers that are published in transnational um, editorials like Alfaguara, the ones that are well known, and they have like a list of Latin American authors that are going to be translated, right? Because they sell. But these stories, they won't be translated easily unless it's done by a different group, and you wouldn't hear about them otherwise. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
I kind of have two questions, but I just was going to start off with the one. Based kind of off what you just said, and reflecting on the projects we're working on, what do you have advice on how to sort through that saturated circulation of male perspectives, and also of Western perspectives, in order to be able to find more stories that have been silenced, and also originating stories that have been retold and therefore selected details?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, it is very important, like I teach literature and film, and I have a film course by women's directors right now in Latin America. This weekend, we brought a director from Peru, and she was telling her story, right? That, and I bring them because, otherwise you don't know about them. And she was telling how difficult it was to do her film. It took her over a decade to be able to do it, because nobody will give her money, first of all, because she is a woman. She's from Peru. Although she's a very good, she is a PhD and she's published, she's a known writer, but nobody will really trust her doing this project, right? So, and then a lot of things that it is interesting what you are asking, because sometimes I read many theory in particularly studying Latin America, that has like a process of decolonization, but I see a lot of translation of works of local people in Latin America. So it is very difficult because if you don't have access or you don't, now there are a lot more translations than they used to be of different um, authors and theories that have been writing about these for centuries in Latin America, right? But that we were not able to read them. And yes, it is important to see if you can find that information when you write a work. For me, it's very important for my work because for me, the most important thing is to contextualize it. Where was it produced? Within what political, historical moment? What was taking place at that moment in that part of the world, in that history? And what was produced at that time? Like when I was studying the 19th century, what I really read everything that was done at that time to understand with eyes of the 19th century to the best that I could, instead of imposing my 20th century perspective into the readings, right? So I try to do that with all my works, the ones that I read. So like I studied, I went to see the reports of the commission. I read them all. I went to the sites to understand really what is taking place, and I'm reading what is produced there um, because they're seeing it in a particular way, right? So I think your question is very important because I think it's very, very important to contextualize and to see what is produced by other um, authors and theories or other criticism, you know, if it's literature or film, what kind of criticism. There are a lot of journals that have wonderful articles about all of these things that are produced not in the United States. And in the United States, we have a lot of journals about Latin America that are produced here, and they publish in different languages, not only English, for example. So it's good to go to those sources if you can, you know, to find about those sources. A lot of things has been translated nowadays, so I'm sure you can find if you don't um, if you cannot read in the language of your author. I'm sure that there are a lot of translation today about the word criticism or literary theory or other types of theories. There was another fault to your question, right?
No, yeah, that was great. That was a great answer.
Okay, good. Okay, great. All right. What did you learn from the article that impressed you? I want to know that because you probably did not know much about the context besides of my approach to writing about it, right? So was there anything that called your attention in learning about this or that you want to share with me?
I would say like just about everything. Like I didn't know I didn't know anything about it. But I also think it's really cool to see professors like interacting with literature and stories and like I don't know. I feel like we don't get to read a lot of that, so it was cool to see that analysis as well.
Okay, great. I'm glad that it helped you.
Yeah, I also didn't know anything about the internal armed conflicts, so it was really interesting to read about. And I'm glad to hear, that you're writing it for the first, or not the first time, but for the first time in a while in English for that purpose, so that folks like us have the chance to learn about it, because it was really, really interesting. And I also, yeah, I just really appreciated that you did include or that the book you talked about included those two stories from the perspective of the doctor and the soldier,
Mhm.
and having the context of kind of the coercive nature of the state, so that the lower level positions people weren't.
Yeah, because sometimes we say, oh, they are perpetrators, right?
Yeah.
And we want to label them, but then we have to understand all the layers of of the power, how the powers work, especially in colonial situations or imperialist or whatever it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you. I really enjoyed reading it.
Oh, thank you.
I also agree with everyone in terms of just learning about this in general. I actually went to Peru in 2018, and with my school, we went on a trip there and for about a week. And I just, the whole time I was like, I feel like we're not learning enough about like anything here. Like we're just doing the touristy things. And I'm like, there's so much more that I would like to know. But it was it was beautiful and amazing. But I really wish I had learned more. So it was nice to kind of come back to that since it's been so many years since I was there. So it was really nice to learn about it.
Yeah, that's nice that you were able to see that. Yeah, because also, in the transition to erase all these past, which is, it's there, we are bleeding with that, but they have this Marca Peru, like Peru brand, and it's to highlight the wonderful nature's and archaeological sites and the food. Peru has become like #1 touristic place for gourmet food. I mean, it's just like a cover of what is really taking place, and it's and everybody says that, oh yeah, your food is so good. Yes, it is, it's so horrible because you see all these gourmet places that they are so expensive, even if we go with American dollars, that nobody can eat there but the tourists, right? But then it's a cover for what is really taking place in politics and with all the people who suffered so much now with the COVID, which is a big, huge problem because of the informal economy and so many problems from the past that hasn't been resolved. But then everybody goes to that beautiful country to see Machu Picchu, the seven marvel of the world, right? Which is beautiful. I agree. I've eaten there several times, but then you don't know anything about the reality of the country, right? You probably know more about ceviche than anything, but I mean, I say in general, no? Yeah. Okay, well, I think if you don't have any more questions.
Yeah, so thank you, Rocio, for just really provocative and thought-provoking conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. It was very nice talking to you. And I look
Thank
forward
you.
to you at any point